On September 3rd, 1260, something absolutely impossible happened. 20,000 Mongol warriors, the most feared military force on planet Earth, marched confidently across the dusty plains of Palestine toward a place called Ain Jalut. These weren't just any soldiers. These were the descendants of Genghis Khan's unstoppable war machine, an army that hadn't lost a major battle in 40 consecutive years. They had literally annihilated entire civilizations. China? Conquered. Persia? Destroyed. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, burned to ashes. For 4 decades, the Mongols had been the definition of invincible, and now they were marching toward Cairo, expecting to add Egypt to their ever-growing empire within weeks. But hidden in the hills above that valley, a commander named Baybars watched them approach with ice-cold calculation, because what the Mongols didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that they were about to walk straight into the most devastating trap in medieval military history. By sunset that same day, the myth of Mongol invincibility would be shattered forever, and the course of world history would change in a single afternoon of blood and tactical genius. To understand how monumental this defeat actually was, you need to understand just how terrifyingly effective the Mongol military machine had become. We are talking about warriors who could fire 20 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop. Their organizational structure was so rigid and precise that commanders could coordinate complex maneuvers across 50-mile fronts using nothing but flags, horns, and mounted messengers. They operated in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men, and this decimal system allowed them to function like a single organism with thousands of deadly limbs. But their most powerful weapon wasn't their bows or their horses. It was psychological warfare on a scale the world had never seen. The Mongols had perfected a simple but brutal strategy. When they approached a city, they gave the inhabitants exactly 2 choices: surrender immediately, and you might survive as subjects of the Mongol Empire. Resist, and they would systematically massacre every living creature within your walls.
Perhaps our only
Men,
chance.
Women, children, even the animals. No exceptions, no mercy. And here's the thing. This wasn't an empty threat. They actually did it, over and over again, which meant that by 1260, entire cities would surrender at the mere sight of Mongol scouts on the horizon. This system of terror had conquered territory stretching from Korea to Hungary, and it seemed completely unstoppable. Just 2 years before Ain Jalut, the Mongols had made an example that sent shockwaves across the entire Islamic world. In 1258, they reached Baghdad, the magnificent capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city that had been the center of Islamic culture, science, and religion for 500 years. The Caliph refused to surrender, so the Mongols showed the world exactly what happened to those who defied them. They sacked the city for weeks, destroying libraries that contained irreplaceable manuscripts from centuries of Islamic scholarship. They murdered hundreds of thousands of civilians in the streets, and in perhaps the most symbolic act of dominance, they executed the Caliph himself by rolling him in carpets and having their horses trample him to death, a method they used because Mongol superstition forbade spilling royal blood directly on the ground. The message was crystal clear. Nothing, not religion, not history, not civilization itself, could stand against Mongol force. So when the Mongols turned their attention to Egypt in 1260, everyone assumed the Mamluks would suffer the same fate. But the Mamluks were not like other armies the Mongols had faced. And this is where the story gets absolutely fascinating. The Mamluk military system was unlike anything else in the medieval world. These weren't peasant conscripts fighting because their lord commanded them. They weren't feudal knights fighting for land and honor. The Mamluks were literally slave warriors, purchased as children from the Caucasus steppes and mountains, then subjected to the most intensive military training program in the medieval world. From the age of 7, these boys did nothing, and I mean nothing, except train for mounted combat. They didn't learn agriculture. They didn't learn crafts. They didn't learn politics. They learned to fight on horseback, period. They practiced archery until they could split an arrow at full gallop. They trained with swords until their blade work became pure instinct. They drilled cavalry charges until they could execute coordinated attacks that could shatter infantry formations like glass. The difference between Mamluks and Mongols came down to this. Mongols were incredible generalists, adaptable and fast, capable of fighting effectively anywhere. Mamluks were precision instruments, designed for one specific purpose: destroying enemy cavalry in close quarters combat. And in September 1260, that specialization was about to prove decisive. Sultan Qutuz and his commander Baybars faced a brutal calculation. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, controlled everything from Iran to Syria. Hulagu's lieutenant, a general named Kitbuqa, commanded the advance force pushing toward Egypt with explicit orders to eliminate the Mamluk Sultanate and complete Mongol domination of the Middle East. On paper, the Mamluks were screwed. The Mongols had never lost a major battle. They had better numbers, better logistics, and 40 years of psychological momentum. Every single Islamic army that had faced them had collapsed. But Baybars had something the Mongols didn't expect. He had studied them. During the Mongol conquest of Syria, Baybars had observed their tactics carefully, and he noticed patterns. The Mongols preferred luring enemies into open terrain where their mobility gave them overwhelming advantages. They were supremely confident when pursuing retreating forces, because that confidence had delivered them countless victories. But in rugged terrain, where their formations couldn't coordinate properly, and pursuit became channeled rather than fluid, they showed vulnerability. Baybars saw the weakness, and he built a plan around it that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Dawn broke on September 3rd, 1260, and Kitbuqa's vanguard crested the hills overlooking the springs at Ain Jalut. What they saw must have filled them with confidence. A Mamluk force of maybe 3,000 cavalry in loose formation near the water. Kitbuqa probably smiled. He'd fought dozens of battles exactly like this, and they all ended the same way. His troops deployed in their standard battle formation. Heavy cavalry in the center, light archers on the flanks, reserve units positioned to exploit any breakthrough. This was the same formation that had crushed armies from Beijing to Budapest. The Mongols advanced, and at arrow range, something happened that seemed to confirm Kitbuqa's expectations. The Mamluk commander raised his banner and pivoted, and the entire Mamluk force began withdrawing from the springs. They were retreating, just like everyone else. Now here's where Baybar's tactical genius becomes absolutely mind-blowing. He understood Mongol doctrine better than most Mongol commanders. Every Mongol officer was trained from childhood that fleeing forces were vulnerable forces, that pursuit was the key to transforming tactical advantage into total victory. This belief had been reinforced by countless battles. At Mohi, Hungarian knights had been massacred by the thousands during their retreat. At Liegnitz, Polish cavalry was annihilated while trying to withdraw. Retreat meant defeat. That was the Mongol gospel. So when Baybar's forces began pulling back, Kitbuqa didn't see a trap. He saw opportunity. And Baybars made absolutely certain the retreat looked genuine. His warriors moved fast enough to suggest fear, but slow enough to remain tempting targets. They kept their formations intact but loose, like an army trying desperately to maintain discipline while retreating under pressure. Some Mamluk warriors even fell to Mongol arrows, which confirmed to Kitbuqa that this was a real retreat, not a feint. Mile after mile, the Mongols pushed deeper into the valley, and with every mile, their formation stretched. The faster units pulled ahead. The slower units lagged behind. That tight coordination that made Mongol armies so devastating began to loosen as the pursuit gained momentum. Meanwhile, Baybar's rear guard fought hard enough to seem desperate, but poorly enough to encourage the Mongols to keep pressing. When the pressure intensified, small groups would detach from the main Mamluk force, simulating the kind of unit collapse that preceded a total rout. After 3 miles of this carefully orchestrated retreat, Kitbuqa made his fatal decision. He saw what looked like a disintegrating enemy force ahead of him, and he committed his reserves. The entire Mongol army was now stretched along the valley floor, their complete attention focused on the Mamluks ahead, their formations disrupted by the terrain and the pursuit. And that's when Baybar sprang the trap. From the hills on both sides of the valley, hidden forces that had been waiting in absolute silence suddenly appeared. On the eastern side, Sultan Kutus commanded nearly 5,000 heavy cavalry. On the western side, Baybar's lieutenant controlled 4,000 mounted warriors. At the same moment, the retreating Mamluk vanguard wheeled around and charged back toward the pursuing Mongols. In seconds, the Mongols went from pursuing a defeated enemy to being surrounded by fresh cavalry charging from 3 directions. The psychological impact was devastating. Even more crucial, the Mongol battlefield communication system, which worked brilliantly in open terrain, collapsed completely in the chaos. Unit commanders couldn't see their superiors through the dust and confusion. Horn signals were drowned out by the thunder of hooves and the clash of weapons. That famous decimal system that had coordinated armies across continents became useless in minutes. The Mongols had been divided, disoriented, and trapped, and now they had to fight the one type of battle they were least prepared for: close quarters mounted combat against an enemy that had trained their entire lives for exactly this scenario. This is where the Mamluk training advantage became absolutely critical. In mobile archery and coordinated maneuvers across open ground, the Mongols were unmatched. But in the brutal melee that erupted in that valley, the Mamluks had every advantage. Their armor was heavier and absorbed impacts from Mongol arrows that would have killed lighter armored troops. Their swordplay, honed through decades of intensive training, cut through Mongol formations with surgical precision. Even their horses were different. Mamluk mounts were trained specifically for the chaos of cavalry combat, while Mongol horses were bred for speed and endurance across open terrain. Within the confined space of the valley, surrounded and outnumbered in the immediate combat zone, individual skill became more important than tactical coordination. And in individual skill, warrior for warrior, the Mamluks were superior. Kitbuqa, a veteran commander who had probably fought in dozens of victorious campaigns, realized too late that he'd been completely outmaneuvered. He tried desperately to rally his dispersed forces, but the tactical situation was hopeless. When he fell, pierced by a Mamluk lance, whatever remained of Mongol resistance collapsed completely. The survivors who managed to escape fled toward Damascus, carrying with them more than just news of a military defeat. They carried the death of an idea that had dominated the medieval world for 40 years. The idea that the Mongols were invincible. The consequences of this single battle rippled across 3 continents. For the first time since Genghis Khan had unified the Mongol tribes, a major Mongol army had been completely destroyed in a pitched battle, not defeated through siege warfare or guerrilla tactics, but annihilated in direct confrontation where Mongol superiority was supposed to be absolute. In Europe, where kings had been preparing for what seemed like an inevitable Mongol invasion, the news triggered celebrations from Paris to Vienna. The unstoppable force had been stopped. In the Islamic world, Ain Jalut triggered a renaissance of resistance. Syrian cities that had submitted to Mongol rule began expelling their occupiers. From Aleppo to Homs, local commanders who had accepted Hulagu's authority suddenly found the courage to rebel, because the psychological foundation of Mongol expansion had been shattered. That expansion was built on a simple premise. Resistance was futile because Mongol victory was inevitable. That premise died in the dust of Ain Jalut. Hulagu faced an impossible choice. He could commit his remaining forces to avenging Kitbuqa's defeat, but that would leave his eastern territories vulnerable to Chinese rebellion. Or he could consolidate his existing conquests and accept that Mongol expansion had reached its limit. He chose consolidation, and the Mongol war machine that had rolled from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea was permanently halted at Egypt's borders. What made Ain Jalut different from previous Mongol setbacks was that it offered no excuses. When the Mongols failed to conquer Japan, they could blame typhoons. When they withdrew from Eastern Europe, they could cite overextended supply lines and political instability following the Great Khan's death. But at Ain Jalut, the weather was perfect, supplies were adequate, command was unified, the troops were veterans, and the general was experienced. The Mamluks had simply beaten them through superior tactics and training. They proved that Mongol military dominance wasn't based on supernatural invincibility. It was based on specific tactical advantages that could be countered by the right adversary in the right circumstances. And Baybars had identified those circumstances and exploited them with devastating precision. Within one generation of Ain Jalut, the unified Mongol Empire fractured into competing khanates: the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, and the Chagatai Khanate, all claiming legitimacy, but none possessing the overwhelming military superiority that had made Mongol conquest seem inevitable. The age of Mongol expansion had ended, and the age of Mongol decline had begun, and it all traced back to a place called Ain Jalut, where a brilliant commander proved that even the world's most feared army could be destroyed by the right trap at the right moment. September 3rd, 1260, was the day tactical genius triumphed over military reputation, and Baybars accomplished what no general before him had managed. He transformed the Mongols' greatest strength into their fatal weakness through perfect deception and flawless execution. And that's the secret of how the invincible Mongols were finally defeated in a single day.
Forward! For the Great Khan!
Here, at Ain Jalut.
A risky gambit, but perhaps our only chance.